So we're looking at the issue of what does the gospel say about race and ethnicity? And perhaps one of the questions you might be asking is, why are we talking about this now? Um, well, there's a number of kind of calendar, life of our church reasons why this is a good time to address these topics from the Bible. The first is our upcoming missions conference. Hopefully you've seen the beautiful brochure that our communications team led by Allison Barger has put together for our missions conference. But the theme of our conference is good news for a new Memphis. And we're going to be looking at multi-racial, multi-ethnic church planting here in Memphis. We have a number of folks who are going to come and help us think about that. Folks like Hernando Cianez, who is the M&A Director of Hispanic Church Planting. Folks like Randy Neighbors, who planted New City Fellowship in Chattanooga, now leads the New City Network. Folks like Christ Fellowship from Horn Lake, which is pastored by a multiracial team just across the state line in in Horn Lake, Mississippi. Folks like Russ Whitfield, who pastors Grace Mosaic, a PCA church in Washington, D.C., northeast section of Washington, D.C., who are going to help us think about multi-ethnic, multiracial church planting here in a city that is majority African American. What does that look like? How do we reach our Jerusalem with the gospel? Well, you might be thinking, well, why should we do that? Why is that important for us? Well, because the Bible holds out a vision of God's people that includes the nations. And it's true from Genesis all the way to Revelation. I want to show you that so that our missions conference will make sense to you. Another reason, though, why it's important for us to be thinking about this topic at this time is to love our neighborhood well. One of the things I've been talking about even before I got here, but certainly since I've been here, is we believe that God's calling us to be new people for a new Memphis. But sometimes thinking about our city, 1.4 million strong, can feel a little abstract. So what does it look like to be new people for a new Memphis? It looks like living and loving locally. It means living and loving in this particular geography, this particular place in which we find ourselves by the very fact that our church has been on this corner since 1965. What is this neighborhood? We are smack dab in the middle of White Station School District. This school district is actually the most racially diverse school district in the entire city. White Station Middle and White Station High School are evenly divided white and black, with Latino and Asians as well as part of that racial mix. In that school district, what you see in those public schools is represented in our neighborhood. Sometimes we let ourselves off the hook by saying, well, everyone in East Memphis is just like me. No, that's not the case. So if we're going to love our neighborhood well with the gospel, why should we do that? What's the biblical imperative to do that? Well, the biblical imperative to do that is that from Genesis to Revelation, God's mission to his world is to create a new humanity in the church in which the dividing wall of hostility is torn down by the cross so that we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic people. So that's another reason. And then also, as you know, this year, 2018, is the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. And our city has been and will continue to be the focus of so much thought and effort in thinking about issues of racial reconciliation and racial justice. But if we, Memphis, if we're going to be a beloved community, how much more so is that going to happen not by politics, not going to happen by fiat, it's not going to happen because the city council says it's going to happen. The only way we're going to be the beloved community that King looked for is if the gospel actually goes forth from the church and changes us and changes our neighborhood and changes our city. The gospel is the only hope for that. Well, then the question comes, does the gospel actually push us in that direction? Yes, it does. The Bible holds out one new humanity, as I've been going to be saying over and over again. So that's why we're going to be talking about this now. Now, just to make it, this is not the social gospel. The social gospel was a movement that really took shape in around 1880 reached its height around 1910, and by the 1920s was already on the way out. It's centered on the redefinition of the gospel away from individual categories to corporate categories. So sin was no longer thought of in terms of individual sin and individual salvation, needing a Savior who paid for individual sins, but rather was thought of exclusively in corporate and systemic categories. That was the social gospel that Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch promoted. This is not that. No, we still, as you know, if you've heard me, we still preach the old-time gospel that individuals need to repent and believe in Jesus Christ. You'll hear it again on Sunday from Mark chapter 1, verses 14 to 20. But having said that, the gospel does have a social application. It does have a social implication. It is not merely an individual, internal, private matter. It touches every area of our lives. And we, as those who love the Reformed faith, we of all people should know that. It was one of the great Reformed theologians, you'll hear me talk about on Sunday night, Abraham Kuyper, who said that there's no square inch of this world over which Jesus does not put his finger and say, mine. And that's not just a geographic claim, that's actually a life claim. So that politics and art and science, business, education, family, marriage, whatever area of life you want to talk about, Jesus puts his finger on that and says, mine. He's Lord over all things. Well, if he's Lord over all things, then certainly he's Lord in this area. When it comes to how people of different races relate to one another as one people of God, as a church. So this is not the social gospel, but the gospel does have a social implication and application. Likewise, this isn't political correctness. This isn't what this is about. But having said that, it is an attempt to see that the Bible does address every area of life. And if the Bible does address that, this issue as well, I want to make the case that it does so particularly in the context of God's mission to his world. So with that as kind of an opening framework, we need to first kind of lay some groundwork by giving you some basic definitions. When we talk about race and ethnicity, what do we mean? What are we talking about? Well, the definition of race that the PCA pastoral letter from 2002 gives has actually become a kind of standard definition. If you've read John Piper's book, Bloodlines, he actually points to the PCA's definition of race as a really excellent, solid, working definition of race. In the pastoral letter, which, by the way, our session has adopted as our position paper on these matters, the pastoral letter said the word race, as used in this pastoral letter, is not a scientific classification. Rather, in the language of one author, the term race is used to denote a social phenomenon with a biological component. That is, the term race not only pertains to the color of skin and other biological factors, but also may include cultural factors, associations, and assumptions that we attach to certain races as well. So when we use that word race, most commonly, we're talking about biological factors in which cultural factors may enter in. That's kind of colloquially how we talk about it, and that seems to be a good working definition of the word race. Likewise, word ethnicity, that's another word that sometimes some people feel more comfortable with that word. Ethnicity is equally difficult to define. J. Daniel Hayes, in his book From Every People and Nation, he says, because ethnic identity is socially constructed and subjectively perceived, it is impossible to find an objective set of criteria that defines the ethnic group in every situation. But traditionally, ethnic identity has been understood as connected to either genetics, as physical appearance, language, and or religion. And that's actually really helpful too, because as you look through history over thousands of years, that those categories, physical appearance, language, religion, those have been significant demarcation lines that mark out one race or ethnicity from another. And when you look at those two definitions of race and ethnicity, and you kind of overlap them, there's actually there's there's similarity when the terms are used sociologically. But there's also an obvious difficulty, and we're going to see this as we move along, in trying to define race simply biologically. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to identify race biologically is we're all mixed races. I mean, that's one of the things that's really fascinating. Those of you who've kind of sent away your saliva with that 23andMe, right? And you get the report back, and you're shocked at how all these various ethnicities they're all rumbling around in your DNA and your saliva, if you will. Who knew? I'm Italian and German and Irish and Indian and all the rest, all in my saliva, right? We're all ultimately mixed races. And so trying to draw boundary lines can be really challenging. The other thing here that makes it a little challenging, of course, is we're all actually cousins. No, we're not all from Mississippi. But we all are actually cousins because we're all actually related to one another, biblically speaking, through Noah, and then before him through Adam, right? Noah functions as a second Adam. The whole world is washed clean. Adam and his 3 sons come out of the ark. All of humanity is fruitful and multiplied from there, right? So trying to draw lines biologically when we talk about race and ethnicity can get a little difficult. But that said, the Bible does recognize the reality of ethnicity. It does recognize race. And I'm going to show you that both from a historical standpoint and then applying that to the Bible. You're going to see that. But I think it's really important to stress this at the beginning. In my previous presbytery, we, out of the aftermath of the PCA working through issues related to the civil rights era and confessing our sins in relationship to that period, our presbytery considered a committee report that essentially urged the presbytery to adopt the 2002 to 2004 position paper and pastoral letter on the gospel and race. At one point in the debate, one of our teaching elders stood up and said, "I don't believe in such a thing as race. We're all one race in Adam. Race is not in the Bible." Well, I know what he was trying to say, and he was very good-hearted, well-meaning. He was just wrong. He was just wrong. Because the Bible clearly does talk about race and ethnicity. Because it's actually an embedded document in a social cultural reality called the ancient Near East. So in order to show you that, I'm just going to name briefly, those of you who follow me on Twitter, I actually tweeted out, I have 2 hours of material and 55 minutes to give it to you. So I'm talking really fast, okay? But I think this is really important to just name some of the people, the ethnic people of the ancient world, the different racial divisions, because all too often, and I'll say this again here in a minute, we read the Bible as though these people are just like us, right? I mean, how many of you, I've done this, so I'll just freely admit it, but how many of you, when you read the Bible and you get to Moses, or you get to David, everybody wants to be like David, or you get to Peter, you picture them in your mind as a 6'1", 165-pound with a great head of hair that's slightly graying, no muscles but can run a pretty fast 5K, just like me, right? David's he looks just like me. Moses looks just like, no, they don't. They don't. They don't look just like us. And so one of the things that we need to realize is we all read the Bible with a certain set of cultural glasses. And they're the glasses that we draw from our own cultural place and time and moment. That's not a fault per se. It's natural. It's called swimming in the water. David Foster Wallace, the great novelist who ended up committing suicide, gave a powerful and significant commencement speech, I believe it was at Cornell University, called "This is Water." And he opens the speech by telling this little parable. The 2 young fish who were swimming along, and an older fish comes and swims right by them and looks at them and kind of smirks and says, "So how's the water?" Swims away. The young fish look at each other. "What's water?" They never even thought of the fact that they were in water. And we tend not to think of the fact we are in water. And we read the Bible as though we are in that water. And we don't cross the horizon from our horizon to the horizon of the ancient Near Eastern world. Because when we do, what we're going to find is there were various ethnic groups, and they're all represented in the Bible. They're Asiatic or Semitic peoples, and that would include the Israelites. As you see on the slide, Israelite conceptions about the need to maintain boundaries between themselves and other Semitic peoples, like the Canaanites, the Amorites, were presented in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But those divisions were put in place largely on a religious basis, not so much on a racial basis. Now, over time, what's going to happen in Old Testament Israel as you come into the New Testament? There's going to be a racial religious boundary that's placed. But really, the dividing line, the boundary that God put in place in the Torah, was a religious boundary. Now, what's significant, of course, as you read the Old Testament is what? They don't observe the boundary. That's actually one of the big problems, right? Is that God's people, the Israelites, they're sleeping with and having babies with Canaanites and Amorites and Ammonites and Moabites and all the rest. But that signals that there's mixing going on in these Asiatic and Semitic peoples. And so, as a result, while we can talk about Semitic peoples as a group, there's a great deal of movement within that group because of intermarriage. So when we think then about these peoples, these Asiatic or Semitic peoples, one line of demarcation within Semitic peoples is language. There were 2 main family groups, an East Semitic family group represented by the language Akkadian, which they actually offered at Westminster Seminary. I did not take it because I'm not good at languages. But Akkadian, those who spoke Akkadian did butt up against Israelites. And there's comparative religion studies that look at both from a philological standpoint, the relationship between Akkadian and Hebrew, but also in terms of cultural realities. Tremper Longman, one of my former professors, did a lot with Akkadian. So that's East Semitic language. And then West Semitic language would be like Hebrew, Arabic, and other languages. Those West Semitic languages, those included all of Israel's neighbors, the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Amorites, Aramaic-speaking peoples. It's notable that Israel's patriarchs come out of Mesopotamia. It was said of George Whitefield, every time I say this word, I think this. It's said of George Whitefield that he could make women cry just by the way he said Mesopotamia. I noticed none of the ladies here were crying when I said it. But Israel's founders, right, Abraham, comes from Ur of the Chaldees. He comes out of Mesopotamia. And they spoke one of the West Semitic languages. They looked like their neighbors. They represented a mix of Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and even Egyptian biological features. So one of the kind of striking things, and I'll hit it as we go through Genesis, is all the intermarriage that goes on between the Israelites, representing Semitic peoples, and the other ethnic groups around them. But suffice it to say, when we talk about Semitic peoples, Canaanites, Israelites, Ammonites, those are the kind of the main players that you find in the Bible. But there's another group, another racial group, another ethnic group that's mentioned in the Bible. Those are the Cushites. The term Cushite represents a continuous civilization that stretched along the banks of the Nile, south of Egypt, at kind of the headwaters of the Nile's cataracts in what is now modern Sudan. You can't see that map that I stole from the ESV Study Bible super great on the slide, but you'll notice that the lower part that says Cush at the bottom, lower than Upper Egypt, that's the nation that would be related to the Cushites. Sometimes it's called Nubia. also referred to as other names, Wawat or Meroe, or sometimes Ethiopia. Although Ethiopia, strictly speaking, even biblically speaking, in the New Testament era, would be to the east of the ancient kingdom of Cush. Cush is different from modern-day Ethiopia, but part of the reason why that sometimes gets confused is around the 4th century BC, Greeks, and they, of course, dominated language-wise and civilization-wise, they referred to all people south of Egypt as burnt faces or Ethiopians. So burnt faces, those who had dark faces, they were all indiscriminately identified as Ethiopians, whether they were from the kingdom of Ethiopia or whether they were from the ancient kingdom of Cush. That was a kind of a Greek thing. That doesn't actually represent reality on the ground. Cushites were black African people with classic Negroid features, and they're consistently presented that way in ancient Egyptian art. So on the slide, I don't know how well you can see it, but that is that's an Egyptian painting, probably from New Kingdom era around 1500 BC, and you can see there two prisoners, and on the left is an Asiatic prisoner, and on the right is a Nubian or Cushite prisoner. And when you look at this ancient art from 1500 BC, the Cushite is presented with what we would call classic Negroid features. In fact, Jeremiah 13 would use the dark skin of a Cushite in a proverbial saying. It's easier for a leopard to change its spots or for a Cushite to change its skin than it is for Israel to repent. So even there, you've got these Semitic peoples, these Asiatic peoples noted in the Bible, particularly with the patriarchs, but you have Cushites, and I'm going to show you Cushites all through the Old Testament. They are present. They are very much present and recognized as a different racial and ethnic group. They were often hired out as mercenaries, useful especially with the bow. They were in regular cultural and economic exchange with Egyptians, and then later in the Old Testament, they would find their way to Palestine. We'll see first in 2 Samuel 18, after the death of Solomon, Joab chooses a Cushite to go to deliver the news to David. Part of the reason, the Cushite was in the army, he was a mercenary, also faster runner than anyone else, but he was present and recognized as racially different as a Cushite, part of David's army. So, again, another group that's very much present in the Bible. Of course, you have the Egyptians as well. The ancient Egyptians were likely a mixture of both black, African, and Asiatic elements. And there's a lot of evidence in the ancient Near Eastern world that intermarriage, particularly between Cushites and Asiatic peoples, was a commonplace. Part of the reason for that is Egypt has a constant influx of different ethnic groups, whether by either they are conquering or they're being conquered. So an example of that would be Joseph in Genesis chapter 41. There is no trouble in the Egyptian mind for David, a Semitic Asiatic person, to marry the daughter of the high priest of On and be included in the government of Egypt. By the 600s BC, the leaders of Egypt actually aren't what we would think of as classic Egyptians. They're actually Cushites. So that when Josiah dies in around 609 BC, waiting for the Egyptians led by King Necho, you might remember those names if you've studied that period. Necho was actually a Cushite. He was actually black because the Cushites ruled Egypt in that time. So again, the racial and ethnic diversity of the ancient world is actually present, and it's represented in ancient art. So of course, here's a painting from around 1350 BC of an Egyptian leader, and he's brown. He's a brown-skinned person. So you have this diversity that's recognized in the ancient world. The fourth major ethnic group in the ancient world is the Indo-Europeans. In appearance, they would be the closest to Caucasian that you would find in the Bible. And there's two big groups. These aren't going to be really, if you feel racial pride, they're not great groups to be identified with. The Philistines and the Hittites. Neither one of them are heroes in the Bible, of course. David had great fun cutting off the foreskins of the Philistines. The Hittites do make an appearance as well in the Bible as a major civilization in what we, in the ancient world, would have called Asia Minor, now modern-day Turkey. They, at the end of their empire, they would migrate, the Hittites did, migrate to modern-day Syria, and David would encounter them as part of his extension of his kingdom to the north and east through what we would call modern-day Syria. But really, the Philistines and the Hittites are kind of on the periphery, but they're very much present, and they represent another ethnic group. Now, again, just to remind you, why is this important? Why did I feel it was important to tell you some of this? Well, it's important so that we don't ever come to the place of saying there is no such thing as race and ethnicity in the Bible. Now, that's just not true. Now, there is, in fact, great diversity, ethnic and racial diversity in the Bible. Part of recognizing that, then, means that when you come across the word Cush in the Bible, you should never read that just kind of blankly, like the way I read Russian novels. Anyone ever have this trouble when they read Russian novels? I can't pronounce any of the names. So, like, you read Dostoevsky, like Brothers Karamazov, or however you say, and so, I'll be reading along, and you come across his name, and it says, blah, 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 and I just say, Jim. You're going to be Jim the rest of this novel. And then I'll come up to another name, and you're going to be Bob. All the way through this novel, whenever I see that name, I'm going to translate that as Bob. It's probably part of the reason why I've really never fully understood Russian novelists, right? We tend to do the same thing when we read the Bible, don't we? I mean, honest. When you read the word Cush, you don't know what that means and what that represents. You think of that as Bob. And when you read the word Philistine, you don't really know what that represents ethnically, racially. That's Jim, right? I mean, that's how we read the Bible, because we don't fully recognize who these peoples are, and so we just glide over them. If we can begin to read the Bible as though not everyone looks like us, or they're not just nameless, faceless, ethnicless, raceless peoples, suddenly the Bible is filled with this kind of fascinating world that opens to us. Kind of this pell-mell atmosphere where Asiatic peoples and Egyptians and Cushites, Philistines that represent Indo-Europeans and others are all in this world moving back and forth. It's almost like what I picture, at least from the movies, like an Egyptian bazaar, right? Where all these people are moving back and forth. They're all in the pages of your Bible. You didn't even know it. We're going to see that as we go through tonight, as we look at just kind of biblically, theologically. I want to take you through the first 12 chapters of Genesis and then leave the rest of the Old Testament for next week. Strap in. But tonight, just the first 12 chapters, just to think a little bit about some of the key ideas as it applies to this issue of race and ethnicity. One of the things we have to say at the very get-go is that all of humanity is created in the image of God. Now, as good Bible-believing, inerrantist Presbyterians, we would all affirm that. I mean, we've known since Sunday school days, Genesis 1:26, then God said, "Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now, the fountainhead of humanity, as you come to Genesis 1, is not identifiable by a race or ethnicity. We can't come to Genesis 1. We don't have enough information to say Asiatic or Semitic or Egyptian or Cushite or Indo-European. But in fact, Adam and Eve represented all humanity and all races in themselves. They're the very headwaters, the very fountainhead of all of the diversity that would come out of them. They represented them in them. So, as a result, every human being, we would say, with Acts chapter 17, verse 26, shares the same ancestry. We share the same blood. Now, I'm going to come back when we get to the New Testament period, back to that text, because that text has been used to defend segregation, Acts 17, verse 26, and I need to blow that up for you. But for right now, that first part of Acts 17:26, we are all of one blood, refers back to this idea that in Adam and Eve, as the fountainhead of humanity, all of humanity shares the same ancestry. All races are represented in themselves. Further, every human being that comes from Adam and Eve, no matter who they are or what condition in which they find themselves, is an image bearer. That's Genesis 1. That's also Psalm 8. That's many other places as well. What is man that you're mindful of him? Son of man that you should care for him? You have crowned him with glory and honor. In fact, you have made him a little lower than the angels. Actually, the Hebrew there, you have made him a little lower than the Elohim, a little lower than God. And that's not just true of white people or black people or Latino people or Asian people. That's true of all of us. Every human being, because they are found in the fountainhead, Adam and Eve, are image bearers. They bear the image of God. So racism or ethnocentrism, which presumes that one's race or ethnicity is superior to another, whether that's white ethnocentrism, whether that's black ethnocentrism, whether that's Latino or Asian ethnocentrism, is actually contradicted by Genesis 1 and Psalm 8. All peoples have been created in the image of God because we all share a common ancestry from the first human beings, the first parents, Adam and Eve. But not only is every race contained in Adam and so created in the image of God, every race is created in Adam and so experiences the effects of the fall. Every race is represented in Adam and so experiences the effects of the fall. As the fountainhead or the headwaters of humanity, that fountainhead or those headwaters, they were poisoned. They were poisoned at the very beginning, and they have affected every people and all people. We all carry the contagion of guilt and corruption from our first parents, Adam. Again, whether you're white or black or Latino or Asian or whatever ethnicity you would claim, you are a image bearer and a sinner. Or as Francis Schaeffer said, you are a glorious ruin. So no race or ethnicity is more sinful than another. There's not one that is more depraved than another. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's because of the next text that people often go to think about race and ethnicity in the Bible. That would be Genesis chapter 9 and the so-called curse of Ham. For those of you who don't remember the curse of Ham or Genesis chapter 9, this is how this goes. After Noah and his sons get off the ark, Noah began to be a man of the soil. And he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So this is the passage that people often talk about as the curse of Ham. And this text has been used throughout history, particularly American history, to wrongly justify the oppression of Africans and African Americans. Stephen Haynes' book, Noah's Curse, is an excellent treatment of the way the curse of Ham has been used over 200 years in biblical interpretation. It's really a fascinating book. But I tried to slow down to catch it. But those of you who are really careful Bible readers, maybe you caught it too. Was this cursed the curse of Ham? Or who's cursed? Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. And then may God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem and let Canaan be his servant. Technically speaking, this isn't the curse of Ham. It's the curse of Canaan. So that's actually really important, because as you go forward from Genesis 9 and you read through the Bible, who is Israel's great enemy when they come to the promised land? The Canaanites. Who are the peoples that are to be eliminated as Israel comes into the promised land? Oh, the Canaanites. So then we have to step back and say, okay, and as Israel is hearing this story, sitting on the plain of Moab, waiting to go into the promised land, which is exactly when they would have heard it, as Moses wrote most of the Pentateuch there on the plains of Moab, as they're hearing this story and they're trying to understand, okay, God, you want us to go in to the promised land and eliminate the Canaanites. Why is that again? Because they're cursed. This is a prophetic curse against Israel's future enemy, which will point forward to why Israel will dominate that region. And it appears that the curse is somewhat sexual, has some sexual reality in the background, and that ties into what Israel would hear in their law. In Leviticus 18, those who commit sexual sin, what should happen to them? They should die. Ham did something. The curse is applied to his son. Now, part of that background stuff I was talking about with the Asiatic and Semitic peoples, who are the Canaanites actually related to linguistically, racially? They're actually ethnically related to Israel. They're Semitic peoples too. So the curse on Ham, or the curse of Ham, that's actually the curse of Canaan, isn't a curse on black people. If you grew up in circles like I grew up in, fundamentalist Baptist circles or just Southern Baptist circles perhaps, you may have heard that the curse of Ham is a curse upon black people. One time I taught about this in a local church. I had someone come up and said, that was me. I grew up in it. In fact, our preachers said that this curse, the curse of Ham, when Noah cursed Ham, really Canaan, when he cursed him, that's how black people got their skin. I mean, that's how this has been used. It has nothing to do with black people or black peoples or Cushites, because they were the black peoples, the colored peoples that Israel would have known. It has nothing to do with that at all. Rather, it helps explain why in the world Israel will end up going into the promised land and eliminating the Canaanites. It's because they're cursed. So, ethnicities in the Bible plays a role, and rightly understanding that will play a role in you understanding Genesis 9. But then you go from Genesis 9 to Genesis 10, and you come to this table of the nations. This has been another text that has, I think, wrongly been understood. When you look at this chapter, Genesis chapter 10, one of the things you notice right off the bat is that this table is a highly stylized table. There are 70 different names listed in the table of nations, but they're not all names. There are, in fact, places, there are tribes, there are kin relationships. What's going on with the Table of Nations? Again, Genesis is written, from Genesis 1 through Genesis 50, is written so that Israel will understand something about their place in the world, especially as they are being brought into the promised land. And so Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations, represents how Israel would have seen the world. As Danny Hayes says, the central organizing feature of the breakdown of the nations in Genesis 10 is not based on physical descent, but rather related to territorial or geopolitical affiliations. In fact, the key listing of peoples, this is like a rogues gallery. From verses 6 to verse 20, you get all of Israel's historic enemies that they will face throughout the Bible. So the sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Canaan. A little bit further, verse 11, he went to Assyria, built Nineveh. Egypt fathers certain players. A little bit later, Canaan will father all these players. Sidon, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Simeonites. Now you know those names because those are the names that God will later say to Moses that they are the peoples to be eliminated when Israel comes into the promised land. A little bit further, verse 19, in the direction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, when you read verses 6 to 19, 6 to 20, and you see these sons of Ham, you see largely the enemies of God's people, but they're not biologically divided. And they're not even linguistically divided, because you have Canaanites, Semitic-speaking peoples, and you have Egyptian-speaking peoples. What you have here is an explanation for why Israel's enemies are the way they are. There's another key feature in chapter 10 that's going to be picked up when you get to chapter 12, and it's this. It comes up 3 times in different ways in chapter 10. In chapter 10, verse 5, you read, "For these coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, and in their nations." And then again in verse 20, at the end of that listing, "These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, by their languages, their lands, and their nations." Chapter 10, verse 31, "These are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations." Now, a key principle for studying the Bible is whenever the Bible repeats something, that's usually really important, right? 3 times in chapter 10, when it summarizes the various peoples in this stylized table that represents Israel's view of the world, it talks about what? It talks about language, clans, nations, peoples. That's not by accident. That is an indication that the Bible recognizes diversity of peoples, diversity of ethnicities, largely marked out by language, but also by other features. The breakdown of the world into languages, tribes, nations, peoples. Again, we'll come back to that. So Genesis 9, at the end of Genesis 9, after Noah and his sons come out into the world, Ham's son, Canaan, is cursed. Gives us an explanation for what's going to happen later with Israel. Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, represents how Israel sees the world, and represents the world in a compendium, 7 times 10, a complete compendium, but emphasizes language and tribes and peoples and nations. Chapter 11, you get to Babel. And what you have here is the division of the nations. Now, one of the things that's interesting, to me at least, is that at least at this stage of the ball game, there's some indication that the world had one language, the same words, verse 1. And these Noah's children have stuck together. We don't know how long they've stuck together. But they come out of the ark, wherever the ark landed, they come out of the ark together, Noah's sons, they move east to Shinar. Now, when Noah and his sons came out of the ark, what did God say to them? Do you remember? God actually gives them once again the command that he had given to Adam and Eve. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Even though sin had been in the world, even though God had washed the world clean, even though sin comes back into the world because Noah brings Noah with him, the command to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to bring it to flourishing, it's still in play. God gives it again. But they come out of the ark, and what do they not do? They don't fill the earth. They don't scatter. They stay together. They hunker down. And they kind of go together like fifth graders, well, no, not fifth graders, 5-year-olds. Have you ever gone to a 5-year-old soccer game? You know how 5-year-old soccer is played? It's like this mass of humanity that follows the ball around, right? And the ball's kind of in the middle, and they're all kicking each other, and they're just kind of all in this mass until somebody kicks it in the goal, and they all celebrate, and they look for the popsicles. That's how Noah's sons were. They were hunkered together. The whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found the plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And what did they say? Come, let's make bricks, burn them thoroughly. They had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and tower with the top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest what? Lest what? Lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. God had said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, be dispersed across the earth. What did they say? We don't want to be dispersed across the earth. Let's build a tower, let's stick together, let's reach to the heavens. But above all, let's not disperse. So God comes down and he sees what's going on. He sees the tower which the children of man had built. And what does he say? He says, behold, they're one people. They all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. So they said, we're not going to get scattered. We're not going to be dispersed. Even though God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, we're not going to do that. God says, oh yeah? Oh yeah? I'm going to disperse you over the entire earth. The rebellion centered on remaining together and not fulfilling God's renewed creation mandate. God's gracious judgment was to confuse their languages, disperse them over the earth, and that's how this table of nations that you have in chapter 10 plays out. The different languages are going to mark out different races and ethnicities related to these peoples, these 70 place names and tribe names and people names that you find in Genesis chapter 10. So already, just in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, what do you have? You have an explanation for the remarkable diversity, racial and ethnic diversity of the world. It's there. But even though it's there, God's not content with it just being there. Because, of course, he's already wiped the world clean once because the imaginations of humans' hearts is evil continually. And so he wants to actually bring about redemption. Diversity was his purpose and plan. Scatter. Scatter. If you don't want to scatter, I'm going to scatter you. And I'm going to mark you out by the diversity of your languages. But notice what he's going to do by taking this man, this pagan from Ur of the Chaldees, a man named Abram. And in Genesis chapter 12, God offers grace for the nations. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Now we rightly recognize that call to Abraham. I call it the second most important promise in the Bible. The first most is in Genesis chapter 3, that the offspring of the woman is going to crush the offspring of the serpent and crush the serpent's head. But the second most important promise is right here in Genesis chapter 12. And when you hear the promise, you hear God saying, go from your country, from your land, from your territory, go to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation that's going to have offspring connected to it. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now that word families is actually the Hebrew word that if we had read Genesis 10 in Hebrew, you would have instantly recognized. It's the Hebrew word that got translated clans. How did God 3 times in Genesis 10 talk about the diversity of the nations in the table of nations? He talked in terms of languages and peoples or clans, peoples and nations. So yeah, languages, peoples, families, peoples, and nations. Well, that same word shows up here in Genesis chapter 12, and he says, through you, Abraham, all of the diverse peoples, the diverse clans that are represented with all of their ethnic diversity, all of their racial diversity, somehow they will all be blessed in and through you. So how is God going to deal with the problem of sin? So that his world, his world, which is his cosmic temple that he has built, how is it going to be filled with his people, which are going to reflect his glory? How is he going to fill the world with image bearers? He's forced the world to scatter, to be dispersed in the nations by confusing their languages. But all you have there is diversity. You don't have redemptive unity. How is God going to bring together a people that's going to reflect his glory, that's going to bring together both the diversity of the nations as well as the unity of redemption? He's going to bless the nations, bless the families of the earth through a son of Abraham. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, how is God going to do that? Where is this son of Abraham going to come who is going to bless all the diverse nations, all the diverse peoples, all the diverse families, and all their diversity of race and ethnicity that are represented in the earth? Where is that son of Abraham going to come from? Well, when you open the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1, and the very first words of the New Testament you read are the book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And what is Matthew telling you? And he actually signals this too with the visit from the wise men, the nations, the people's ethnic difference coming to bow to King Jesus. The very first major story he tells you in Matthew 2, after the birth of Jesus. He's saying, what was promised to Abraham, here it is. His name is Jesus. He is the one who is going to accomplish God's mission of blessing all the families of the earth, of bringing about a single people that is made up of a diversity of ethnicities and races. So we're going to keep tracing that line. But even you can see from the first 12 chapters of Genesis, both, hopefully you've seen the racial and ethnic diversity that's already present in the Bible, but also this larger theme. God's making one new humanity in Jesus Christ. It's his mission to his world. If it's his mission to his world, then surely it's his mission to our city. Right? Right? Let's pray together. Jesus, we do ask that you would shape our hearts and minds so that your heartbeat would be our heartbeat. That just as you desire the salvation of people from every language and tribe and people and nation, from every family, from every clan. Lord, please, we pray that that would be our heartbeat. And just as this church has had a long and distinguished history of going elsewhere with the gospel, internationally with the gospel, as we've sought to do that here in our city, Lord, please give us a passion and desire that we might become a multiracial, multi-ethnic people, both in this particular congregation and in our presbytery here in this place, that we would represent in the church the diversity of the nations, not just white and African American, not just Latino and Asian, but Kenyan and Somalian, Mexican and Costa Rican and Puerto Rican, all of the diversity of the nations, Lord, that we would be together, one new humanity, with the dividing wall torn down by the cross of Jesus Christ. Lord, please, we know that the gospel is our only hope. Drive it deep into our hearts, we pray. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.